30 names, 30 crime scenes, and every one of them ends at the same place, California's death row. Some hunted strangers, some wiped out entire families, and some looked so normal you'd never suspect a thing until the evidence started stacking up. In this video, we're breaking down the state's most brutal condemned inmates, the crimes that put them there, and the patterns that make these cases so disturbing. Stay to the end, because the last few names are where this list gets even darker. And before we start, comment where you're watching from. Number 1. Alejandro Avila. On July 15, 2002, a little girl disappeared from the Smoke Tree Apartments in Stanton while playing outside, and by the next day the search ended in brush near Lake Elsinore. 5-year-old Samantha Runyon had been taken in broad daylight after a man used a lost puppy story to get close enough to grab her and force her into his car. That man was Alejandro Avila. What made Avila especially dangerous was not chaos, but pattern. Prosecutors showed that this was a sexual predator who moved fast, picked an easy target, and expected to slip back into ordinary life before anyone could connect him to the crime. He was wrong. Witness tips led detectives to him. Samantha's DNA was found in his car, and his DNA was recovered under her fingernails. Jurors also heard evidence that other young girls had accused him of molestation before this case. By the end, Avila did not look like a mystery. He looked like a man the evidence had been closing in on. Number 2. James Fayed. In July 2008, Pamela Fayed walked into a meeting tied to her bitter divorce and never made it home. She was stabbed to death in a parking garage in Century City, and investigators quickly decided this was not a random street attack. Prosecutors said it was a paid murder arranged by her husband, James Fayed. Fayed ran a precious metals business and knew how to look polished, which is sometimes useful when your private life is falling apart. The state argued he was under pressure from a vicious divorce, business problems, and the risk that Pamela could damage him in both family court and a federal investigation tied to his company. So instead of fighting her in court, he hired help. Prosecutors said he paid employee Joey Moya, who pulled others into the plot. A rented vehicle, blood evidence, phone records, and insider testimony tightened the case. Then came the real insult. A jailhouse informant recorded Fayed making damaging statements. For a man obsessed with control, he left behind a very messy trail. Number 3. Eric Houston. On May 1, 1992, Lyndhurst High School stopped being a school and became a hostage scene. Students dropped to the floor, teachers were hit, and by the time it was over, 4 people were dead and many others were wounded. The gunman was 20-year-old Eric Houston. According to prosecutors, Houston had been building this grudge for months. He blamed teacher Robert Brenz for failing him, believed that failure kept him from graduating, and told people before the attack that he wanted to go back to the school and shoot people. On the day of the massacre, he bought ammunition, entered campus with a shotgun and a rifle, killed Brenz and 3 students, then held dozens of students hostage for hours while police tried to keep anyone else from dying. Houston later surrendered, but the facts were already set. His lawyers raised mental health issues and abuse claims, yet the jury still found him legally sane. In the end, this was not one bad day. It was a planned act of revenge. Number 4. Vincent Brothers. When police entered a house in Bakersfield in July 2003, they found 5 people dead: Vincent Brothers' wife, his 3 children, and his mother-in-law. The scene looked like a home invasion, but detectives soon started seeing something else: a planned family massacre with just enough fake chaos to waste their time. Brothers was not some drifter or street criminal. He was a school administrator, clean-cut, educated, and calm under pressure, which made the case even worse. Prosecutors said he flew to Ohio for a family gathering, then secretly rented a car, drove back to California, killed his family, and returned to Ohio to keep his alibi intact. It sounds insane, but that was the point. He wanted distance, timing, and confusion, all working for him at once. What broke the story open was the evidence tied to that rental car, including mileage and insect traces that undercut his version of events. In 2007, Vincent Brothers was convicted and sentenced to death. Number 5. Luis Bracamontes. It started like a routine traffic stop in Sacramento in October 2014, and within minutes, Deputy Danny Oliver was dead. What followed was not one shooting, but a moving rampage across 2 counties. Detective Michael Davis Jr. was killed next. Other people were wounded, vehicles were stolen, and the manhunt turned Northern California into a live crime scene. That man was Luis Bracamontes, a convicted felon and repeat deportee who had already been removed from the U.S. more than once. Prosecutors said he and his wife ran, carjacked, fired at officers, and kept pushing forward until he was finally cornered near Auburn. The facts were already ugly, but Bracamontes somehow made himself look even worse in court. He cursed, laughed, threatened to kill more officers, and acted like the trial was beneath him until the judge had him removed from the courtroom. In 2018, he was convicted of murdering 2 law enforcement officers and sentenced to death. Some killers deny what they are. Bracamontes advertised it. Number 6. Raymond Oyler. Before sunrise on October 26, 2006, the Esperanza fire was already tearing through dry hills in Riverside County when 5 firefighters from Engine 57 drove into a deadly burn area and never came back out. This was not treated as a bad wildfire or a tragic accident. Prosecutors said it was murder caused by arson. Raymond Oyler was accused of setting the fire that killed those 5 men, but the case against him went beyond one blaze. Investigators linked him to a larger pattern of arsons across the Banning Pass area, which made him look less like a reckless idiot and more like someone escalating on purpose. Witnesses said he liked watching fires burn. DNA evidence tied him to materials used to start some of them, and prosecutors argued that he had grown bolder each time until people finally died. In 2009, Raymond Oyler was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder and multiple arson charges, then sentenced to death. He did not just start fires. He kept feeding one until it buried 5 firefighters. Number 7. Charles Merritt. Detectives would eventually find the McStay family in shallow graves in the Mojave Desert, beaten to death and buried with a sledgehammer. The man at the center of it was Charles Merritt, Joseph McStay's business partner and the last known person to meet him before Joseph, Summer, and their 2 young sons disappeared in February 2010. Prosecutors said Merritt was drowning in debt, owed Joseph money, and started writing checks to himself from Joseph's business account right after the family vanished. Then came the evidence that crushed his defense. Merritt's DNA inside the family's Isuzu, phone records, and financial records showing thousands taken after the murders. He kept insisting he was innocent, but by 2019, a jury convicted him of murdering all 4 family members for financial gain. In 2020, he was sentenced to death. Merritt tried to bury a family and a paper trail at the same time. The graves were hidden. The money was not. Number 8. Michael Morales. On a dark road in Ventura County, 17-year-old Terry Winchell was attacked, raped, and murdered in January 1981. Michael Morales was 21, and prosecutors said he carried out the crime with his cousin Rick Ortega, whose jealousy helped drive the plan. Police moved fast. Within 2 days, Morales was arrested, and investigators found evidence at his home that was hard to explain away. His broken belt stained with Terry's blood, a blood-stained hammer hidden in a refrigerator drawer, and Terry's purse and credit card. In 1983, a jury convicted Morales of rape, murder, and conspiracy, then sentenced him to death. But his story did not stop there. In 2006, California came within hours of executing him before legal challenges shut it down, turning his case into one of the biggest fights over lethal injection in the state. Morales became more than a killer on death row. He became part of the reason California's execution system started breaking in public. Number 9. David Westerfield. By morning, a 7-year-old girl was gone from her bedroom, and San Diego was staring straight into every parent's nightmare. That girl was Danielle Van Dam. Police quickly focused on David Westerfield, the neighbor who lived 2 doors away and was not home that morning. The case tightened when forensic evidence started piling up. Investigators found Danielle's blood on Westerfield's jacket and in his motorhome. They also found her fingerprints near the bed inside that vehicle, along with hair, fibers, and other trace evidence that kept pointing in one direction. Danielle's body was later found off a rural road in Dehesa, and the defense never found a clean way around the physical evidence. In 2002, a jury convicted Westerfield of kidnapping and first-degree murder, along with possession of child pornography. He was sentenced to death in 2003, and the California Supreme Court later upheld the verdict. Westerfield did not lose this case because of one mistake. He lost it because the evidence kept showing up everywhere he had been. Number 10. Skylar DeLeon. The ocean off Newport Beach looked calm, but prosecutors said it became Tom and Jackie Hawk's grave. The couple believed they were meeting a buyer for their yacht. Instead, that buyer was Skylar DeLeon, a man prosecutors described as using a clean, harmless image to get close before the trap closed. Once the Hawks were out on the water, DeLeon and his crew tied them to an anchor and threw them overboard so they could steal the yacht and profit from the deal. Their bodies were never found. Investigators later tied DeLeon to the separate murder of John Jarvie, another killing driven by money. That is what makes this case hit so hard. DeLeon was not some loud, reckless killer. He used trust the way other criminals use a gun. In 2008, a jury convicted DeLeon of 3 murders, and the court later sentenced him to death. This was not business gone bad. It was greed with a handshake. Number 11. Michael Gargiulo. Inside Ashley Elleren's Hollywood home, detectives found a brutal stabbing, and the man later convicted of killing her was Michael Gargiulo. What made him terrifying was how normal he looked. He was not some ghost slipping through town. He was the guy next door. Prosecutors said that pattern mattered. In 2001, Elleren was stabbed to death as she got ready to go out. In 2005, Gargiulo murdered and mutilated Maria Bruno while she slept. In 2008, he attacked Michelle Murphy in her Santa Monica home, but Murphy fought back hard enough to cut him during the struggle, and that handed investigators the DNA that linked all 3 attacks. That is the part that stays with you. He hunted close to home and struck where women should have been safest, inside their own rooms. A jury convicted him in 2019, found him sane, and a judge sentenced him to death in 2021. He did not need darkness to hide. He had suburbia. Number 12. James Daveggio. On a snowy roadside near Lake Tahoe, Vanessa Sampson's body told detectives this was no random attack. Prosecutors said James Daveggio and Michelle Michaud worked like a team, using a green van, restraints, and a plan. Sampson vanished on her way to work in December 1997. Investigators later found the van packed with the kind of evidence no defense lawyer wants to explain: rope, duct tape, a ball gag, modified curling irons, and Sampson's DNA on those items. Court records also tied the pair to other sexual assaults involving young victims, which made the Sampson case look less like one terrible night and more like a pattern already in motion. That is what makes Daveggio different from the usual headline monster. He does not read like a man who lost control. He reads like a man who made preparations. A jury convicted him of murder with kidnapping and rape by instrument special circumstances, and he was sentenced to death. This was not chaos, it was method. Number 13. Gerald Parker. When investigators walked into those homes in Orange County, they kept finding the same kind of horror. Women attacked in their bedrooms, usually at night, with almost no sign the killer had forced his way in. That man was Gerald Parker, a former Marine staff sergeant later tied to a string of murders in the late 1970s. Prosecutors said he targeted women who were alone, slipped in through unlocked doors or open windows, beat them, sexually assaulted them, and left before anyone knew he had been there. For years, the cases sat cold, and Parker kept his name out of them. Then, DNA testing in the 1990s linked him to multiple murders and finally gave police the answer they had missed for years. The case got even worse when that evidence also helped expose that another man had wrongly spent years in prison for one of Parker's crimes. Parker was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death in 1999. Number 14. Dean Carter. One woman survived long enough to tell police what Dean Carter did to her, and that may be the reason his killing spree finally stopped. In the early 1980s, Carter was linked to a brutal run of attacks across California. Prosecutors said he raped women, strangled them, stole their cars and property, and in some cases hid their bodies inside closets or left them in apartments as if that would buy him time. He moved from county to county fast, which made the pattern harder to see until the evidence started piling up. Police finally caught him in Arizona while he was driving a victim's car and carrying items tied to several women, including bank cards and personal property that connected him to multiple crime scenes. Carter was later convicted in separate murder cases out of Los Angeles and San Diego, and California gave him 2 death sentences, which is a brutal way of saying the state had more than enough evidence to bury him in court. Number 15. Daniel Wozniak. By the time police were trying to figure out why Sam Herr had vanished and why Julie Kibuishi turned up dead, Daniel Wozniak was still moving toward his wedding like nothing had happened. Wozniak was a community theater actor in Orange County, but in 2010, prosecutors said he murdered Herr for money, hoping to steal roughly $62,000 Herr had saved, then killed Kibuishi to frame Herr and send detectives in the wrong direction. According to the case, Wozniak lured Herr to a theater complex at the Los Alamitos military base, killed him, cut up the body, and scattered the remains to slow down the investigation. Then he brought Julie into the picture, killed her, and staged the scene to make it look like Herr had attacked her and fled. That was the plan: steal the money, fake the trail, and still get married on schedule. Police arrested Wozniak during his bachelor party, and he was later sentenced to death in 2016. Number 16. Wayne Ford. Deputies in Humboldt County were already dealing with a nightmare when Wayne Ford made it worse. Investigators had been finding human remains near the water, and then Ford walked into the sheriff's office carrying part of a woman's body in a bag. That was not a cry for help. That was the end of a killing run. Ford was a long-haul trucker who preyed on vulnerable women across California in the late 1990s, especially women he believed would be ignored or identified late. Prosecutors said he murdered 4 women, including Tina Gibbs, Lynette White, Patricia Tamez, and a victim later identified as Carrie Ann Cummings. He strangled, sexually assaulted, and dismembered victims, then dumped remains in remote areas to delay identification. One woman survived and testified that Ford bound her, assaulted her, and left her for dead. His lawyers argued mental illness, but the jury still convicted him. Ford was sentenced to death, and his name remains on California's condemned inmate list. Number 17. Richard Farley. It started in a parking lot at ESL in Sunnyvale, then spread through the building in bursts of gunfire. Employees hid under desks, offices turned into trap rooms, and Richard Farley kept shooting. This was not some sudden snap. It was the final step in years of stalking. Farley had become obsessed with his co-worker Laura Black, followed her, called her, watched her, and ignored every warning to back off. Even after losing his job, he kept going. On February 16, 1988, he came back armed with shotguns, rifles, and a huge amount of ammunition. He killed 7 people and wounded 4 more, including Black. Then he held police off for hours before finally surrendering. At trial, prosecutors showed this was organized, deliberate, and personal. Farley did not lose control for one afternoon. He built toward it for years. He was convicted and sentenced to death, and his case is still one of California's clearest examples of stalking turning into mass murder. Number 18. Marcus Wesson. When Fresno police entered Marcus Wesson's house, they found 9 bodies in a back room, most of them children, stacked together inside a home that had already been rotting from the inside for years. Wesson called himself a preacher, but prosecutors said he ran the house like a private cult. He controlled family members through fear, isolation, incest, and sexual abuse, and by the time police got involved, that control had turned deadly. The standoff began after relatives tried to remove children from the home. It ended with a massacre. The victims ranged from a 1-year-old child to young adults in their 20s, all shot inside the house. At trial, the defense tried to shift blame, but prosecutors argued Wesson controlled everyone in that home and drove the entire crime. The jury agreed. He was convicted of 9 murders and sentenced to death. Marcus Wesson was not just the killer in this case. He was the system that made the horror possible. Number 19. Ramon Salcido. At daybreak near a Sonoma dumping site, deputies found 3 little girls in a ditch. 2 were dead. 1 was still alive after her throat had been cut. That was only the first scene. Over the next few hours, Ramon Salcido killed his wife Angela, her mother Marion Richards, her sisters Ruth and Marie, and his supervisor Tracy Tuvey, then shot another supervisor, Kenneth Booty, and left him wounded. Salcido was a winery worker whose life was coming apart under alcohol, cocaine, money trouble, and a marriage that was collapsing in public. On April 14, 1989, all of it turned into a 7-victim rampage across Sonoma and Cotati in about 3 hours. He fled to Mexico, but police caught him within days. A jury later convicted him of 6 first-degree murders, 1 second-degree murder, and 2 attempted murders. 1 child survived, and that survival kept this case from ending in the silence Salcido probably counted on. Number 20. Stephen Gordon. At an Anaheim recycling plant, workers found the body of 21-year-old Jure Estep on a conveyor belt. And that discovery blew open a case that should have been stopped much earlier. Stephen Gordon was already a registered sex offender, homeless, on GPS monitoring, and still moving through Orange County with Frank Cano, while 4 women were being kidnapped and killed. Prosecutors said the pair targeted women in street prostitution in Anaheim and Santa Ana, abducted them, sexually assaulted them, and murdered them. The 4 victims tied to Gordon's case were Kiana Jackson, Josephine Vargas, Martha Anaya, and Estep. 3 of them were never found. Gordon later admitted responsibility, fired his lawyer, and represented himself at trial, which sounds bold until you remember he was drowning in evidence. In 2016, a jury convicted him of murdering all 4 women, and in 2017, a judge sentenced him to death. The ugliest detail is simple. The system was literally tracking him while he hunted. Number 21. Wesley Shermantine. On a remote road near Roberts Island, 2 men were found shot to death inside a parked car. That double murder became part of the case that eventually sent Wesley Shermantine to death row. Shermantine and childhood friend Lauren Herzog were later branded the Speed Freak Killers, a meth-fueled duo tied to a long trail of disappearances across San Joaquin County. At trial, prosecutors proved 4 murders: Howard King, Paul Raymond Kavanaugh, 16-year-old Chevelle Wheeler, and Cindy Vanderheiden. But the case did not get smaller after the conviction. It got darker. Authorities believed the real number of victims was higher, and years later, while sitting on death row, Shermantine drew maps that led investigators to burial sites and human remains near Linden. That is what made him especially cruel. He did not just leave bodies behind. He kept control after the verdict, forcing families to wait while pieces of the truth came back from wells, dirt, and places nobody wanted to search twice. Number 22. Isauro Aguirre. May 22, 2013. Inside a Palmdale apartment, paramedics found 8-year-old Gabriel Fernandez unresponsive, and the scene told them this child had been suffering for a long time. It was not an accident, and it was not a one-time explosion of anger. Prosecutors said the abuse had gone on for months, and at the center of it was Isauro Aguirre, Gabriel's mother's boyfriend. They argued Aguirre targeted Gabriel in part because he believed the boy was gay, which makes the case even darker. This was a grown man taking power over a child who could not fight back, then calling it discipline, like that word could clean anything up. In 2017, Aguirre was convicted of first-degree murder with the special circumstance of torture. In 2018, he was sentenced to death. He remains on California's death row. Some cases are complicated. This one isn't. It was cruelty, control, and a child left defenseless. Number 23. Glenn Helzer. August 2000. By then, 5 people were dead, and Glenn Helzer had wrapped the whole thing in religion like that made it cleaner. It didn't. Helzer was a former financial advisor who turned himself into the leader of a warped little cult called Children of Thunder, then used prophecy as cover for greed, control, and murder. He and his crew targeted Ivan and Annette Steinman, wealthy former clients who trusted him, kidnapped them, extorted them, and killed them. Then came Selena Bishop, Jennifer Villarin, and James Gamble. 5 victims, 1 scheme, and the same cold logic every time. Take the money, remove the witnesses, keep moving. Helzer later pleaded guilty to 5 counts of murder, along with kidnapping, robbery, extortion, and conspiracy. A jury sentenced him to death, and the California Supreme Court upheld that judgment in 2024. As of March 2026, Helzer is still on California's death row. Strip away the Prophet Act, and what's left is simple: a calculating killer with a God complex and a cash motive. Number 24. Cary Stayner, July 21, 1999. Joey Armstrong never made it to work. Her truck was still outside, both front doors were open, and by the next day, searchers found her body in a nearby creek. That murder cracked open one of California's most infamous cases. Cary Stayner was not some stranger passing through Yosemite. He worked at Cedar Lodge, right near the earlier disappearance of Carol Sund, her daughter Julie, and Silvina Peloso. In his own confession, Stayner said he chose them because he did not see a man in the room, so they looked like easy prey. That tells you exactly what kind of predator he was. After Armstrong was killed, investigators closed in, and Stayner later confessed to both Armstrong's murder and the earlier triple murder. He pleaded guilty in the Armstrong case, then was convicted and sentenced to death in California for the Sund-Peloso murders. As of March 2026, he remains on California's condemned inmate list. Weak targets, closed doors, false confidence. That was his whole pattern. Number 25. Chester Turner. Behind a rundown building in Los Angeles, a woman was found raped and strangled, her body dumped like nobody would ask questions. That was exactly the kind of victim Chester Turner counted on. For years, he hunted women in South LA, especially along the Figueroa corridor, where poverty, addiction, and street work made people easier to disappear and easier for the system to ignore. He raped, strangled, and dumped them in alleys, vacant lots, and trash-strewn spaces, then kept moving like the city owed him silence. What finally broke the case was not some brilliant manhunt. It was a DNA sample from a 2002 rape conviction. Once that sample hit the database, cold cases started lining up behind his name. LAPD tied him by DNA to at least 13 murders in Los Angeles from 1987 to 1998, and California still lists him as a condemned inmate. That is a long fall for a man who survived by hiding in plain sight. Number 26. Joseph Naso. On back roads in Northern California, women were found naked, posed, and dumped far from help, which tells you plenty before Joseph Naso even enters the frame. Naso was a former photographer, and prosecutors said he used that job like a fishing lure. He targeted vulnerable women, drugged them, photographed them while they were unconscious, then strangled them and left their bodies in rural areas. The 4 women he was convicted of killing even had matching initials, which is the kind of detail that sounds made up until you realize real predators can be embarrassingly consistent. When police searched his Reno home, they found hundreds of photos, journals, women's clothing, and a handwritten list of 10 that looked a lot like a roadmap of obsession. Naso even acted as his own lawyer at trial, because apparently ego ages better than shame. A Marin County jury convicted him in 2013 of 4 murders, and California still lists him as a condemned inmate. Number 27. William Suff. At 7 in the morning in South Pasadena, Kathy Small was found dead in a nightgown, stabbed and strangled, her body left in the street like the killer had already moved on. For decades, that case sat cold. Then DNA pointed back to William Suff. By then, police already knew him as the Riverside prostitute killer, the man convicted of murdering 12 women and attempting to kill another in Riverside County between 1989 and 1991. What makes Suff even worse is that California was not his first warning label. Years earlier in Texas, he was convicted in the death of his infant daughter, got a 70-year sentence, served about 10 years, and was paroled. Then he went right back to proving parole boards can be disastrously optimistic. He lured vulnerable women into his vehicle, strangled or stabbed them, and dumped their bodies across Riverside and Lake Elsinore. A routine traffic stop helped crack the case, and California still lists him as a condemned inmate. Number 28. David Carpenter. On a California trail, hikers found bodies where people were supposed to find peace. That was David Carpenter's pattern. In 1980 and 1981, the man later called the Trailside Killer stalked remote parks and hiking paths around the Bay Area, waited until victims were isolated, then opened fire and disappeared before anyone understood what happened. This was not some late-life snap. Carpenter already had a long record of sex crimes, assault, kidnapping, and prison time. And once he got out again, the violence got worse. His biggest mistake came when one victim, Stephen Hartle, survived long enough to describe the shooter. That gave police the break they needed. Carpenter was convicted in multiple murders and sentenced to death. The scary part is not just that he killed on public trails. It is that he turned an ordinary weekend habit into a hunting ground, and for a while, nobody knew who was next. Number 29. Charles Ng. At a cabin site in rural California, investigators found buried remains, hidden rooms, and evidence that people had been held there against their will. That is where Charles Ng enters the story. Working with Leonard Lake, Ng was convicted of 11 murders tied to a remote property in Wilseyville, where victims were robbed, imprisoned, abused, and killed. Men, women, even children were among the dead. What makes this case hit so hard is how organized it was. This was not panic, rage, or a bad night. It was planning. It was control. It was two men building a private trap and treating human beings like inventory. The whole case started to fall apart after Lake was caught shoplifting, which would be ridiculous if the body count were not so horrific. Ng fled to Canada, fought extradition for years, then finally stood trial in California, where he was convicted and sentenced to death. Some killers leave chaos. Ng left a system. Number 30. Randy Kraft. A CHP officer pulled over a drifting car just after 1 a.m. in May 1983, expecting a drunk driver and a routine headache. Instead, there was a dead young man in the passenger seat. That stop ended Randy Kraft's run. Known as the Scorecard Killer, Kraft was convicted of murdering 16 young men in California, though investigators believed the real number was much higher. He hunted vulnerable men, often picked them up on the road, drugged them, assaulted them, strangled them, and dumped their bodies along freeways and isolated stretches of pavement. Police also found coded notes that looked like a private score sheet, which tells you everything about how he saw his victims. Not as people, as entries, as marks on a list. Kraft was sentenced to death, and decades later, his name still turns up in cold cases. That is what makes him so disturbing. Even after the trial ended, the count may not have